There I am. I am on page 300, I think 59. No, 360, actually. Um, and we're talking about LaGuardia, who wants to become the mayor in 1933. Moses knew it. Well, okay, LaGuardia also needed Moses, and Moses knew it. To LaGuardia's invitation, he replied with conditions. I told the mayor, he was to recall, that I was not interested in taking the city job unless I had unified power over all the city parks, and even then, only as part of the unified control of the whole metropolitan system of parks and parkway development. Unified was the operative adjective. There were 5 separate independent park departments in New York City in 1933, one for each borough, each with its own borough park commissioner. If the 5 commissionerships were abolished and all 5 departments were consolidated into one, Moses said, he would be willing to be its commissioner. If the commissioner's authority was extended to include not only parks and parkways, not only parks but parkways, and if he was allowed to keep his state jobs. And since the key to a unified parkway program was the Triborough Bridge, he must also insist on control of the independent agency charged with the construction of that bridge, the Triborough Bridge Authority. He had a plan to finance construction of a marine parkway bridge to the Rockaways. The plan was to create another authority to accept the necessary $10 million federal contribution. He wanted to control that authority too. LaGuardia agreed. The mayor-elect could hardly restrain himself from blurting out the news before the arrangement was finalized. Seated at a dinner party next to, here's a really crazy name, Iphigene Ox Sulzberger, who was that's actually, you know what? That actually wasn't that hard to say. Iphigene Ox Sulzberger, who was bemoaning the state of the city's parks, he told her, "Don't worry, I'm appointing the best man in the U.S. as park commissioner." In fact, when Moses suggested that he himself draft the bill consolidating the park departments and setting forth the powers he would possess as New York City Park Commissioner, LaGuardia had seen no reason not to agree to that too. It was the first bill submitted to the legislature by the LaGuardia administration. Neither man considered the Triborough appointment particularly significant. Both still considered the authority nothing more than a toll-collecting agency that would finish building a single bridge and then go out of business as soon as its cost was paid off. But they anticipated opposition in the legislature, whose permission would be required for a state official to take a city job. The upstate Republicans, who were the legislature's leaders, felt that Moses already possessed too much power and would resist giving him more. Democratic legislators from the city would be opposed to his appointment because of the contracts and patronage it would cost the party. And there were philosophical as well as personal and political objections. Concentrating in a single individual authority over both state and city parks and over most major road building projects in the New York metropolitan region would give too much power to that individual, no matter who he was, some state legislators said. Furthermore, in his state job, that individual would be the governor's appointee, in his city job, the mayor's. If the city's elected officials were to veto one of the projects he proposed to them in his capacity as city official, he'd be able to use his influence with the governor to bring the state's influence to bear on the city officials to force the city into compliance with his will. The situation could also work in reverse. The line of reasoning could be carried on indefinitely, said one state senator. No man is big enough to serve 2 masters. This was one reason why there was a law against the simultaneous building of state and city jobs, simultaneous holding of state and city jobs. And some legislators attempted to remind the public there were other equally persuasive reasons. Dual office holding, they said, weakened the constitutional provision that the city should be a separate, independent entity within the state. And then we have an asterisk, and I have to read the asterisk. The footnote. The courts had always emphatically upheld the law against dual office holding. One memorable case, in fact, he always has really good footnotes. One memorable case, in fact, had enlivened the political vocabulary with a new phrase. In 1924, Murray Holbert, the president of the city's board of aldermen, had innocently accepted membership on the Finger Lake State Park Commission, believing that because the park post was unsalaried, it did not fall within the law's purview. But the city comptroller, disagreeing, stripped Holbert of his more important salary-paying city job, and the courts upheld this action, a circumstance which thereafter led Albany wags to refer to any suggestion that a city official be given a state job as an attempt to give the man the finger. That's fun. So I'm surprised Moses. So Moses is probably going to get the finger. Bye, Pearl. There would be plenty of legislative opposition just to his proposed appointment as park commissioner. There was no sense in letting the legislature know that LaGuardia actually intended to appoint Moses to 3 city jobs. But permission was necessary for him to take each of them. The best bill drafter in Albany told LaGuardia not to worry. Buried deep within the bill he drafted, it was Section 607 to be precise, allowing him to accept the park commissionership, was the apparently innocuous phrase, "An unsalaried state officer shall not be ineligible to hold any other salaried office, to hold any other unsalaried office filled by appointment of the mayor." The camouflage worked. Unsalaried offices generally referred to meaningless honorary positions. Not one legislator appears to have realized that it could also refer to an authority commissionership. I have to open the door for Pearl. You need to get out? The opposition that boiled down from Albany anyway was blasted by the press and by reformers who normally would have been the first to oppose a violation of the separation of state and city that they had always viewed as vital, and to oppose giving one man such power. They were not opposed now because the man was the one official they were confident would not abuse that power. And the reformers had considerable influence over the Republican legislators from the city. Soon, Herbert Brownell Jr., already at age 29, not only a state assemblyman, but also a partner in a prestigious Wall Street legal firm, was speaking on behalf of the Moses Bill. Another GOP legislator from the city, J.E. Rice, was arguing against Brownell when, as the Herald Tribune noted, Mr. Rice was called on the telephone from New York and returned to the assembly chamber to withdraw his objection. The string-pulling Long Island barons, who had come to see Moses as a friend, pulled their strings. LaGuardia gave assurances that the city was not surrendering any of its independence. The city retains complete control through its properly constituted authorities over every cent it spends and everything it does. Governor Lehman, admiring Moses, sent the legislature an emergency message to rush the bill through. Both the mayor and the governor, the 2 most powerful men in the state, were on Moses' side. So was the most popular, Al Smith. He publicly supported the appointment. Yeah, it is interesting how he's not a lawyer. He has a PhD in what? Political science? Public policy? Something like that. While the press was still playing up the pledges by Tammany legislators to fight the bill to the finish, Moses knew that the fight was already finished. and that he had won. When a reporter called him for comment after one heated debate, Moses said, "There's nothing to get excited about." On January 19, 1934, Lehman signed the Moses Bill. That same day, Moses joined a line of minor city officials waiting outside LaGuardia's office. When his turn came, he entered the office and was sworn in as New York's first citywide park commissioner. Tammany's 3 Triborough commissioners held 6-year terms, but the financial manipulation of 2 of them had been so blatant that LaGuardia's investigators quickly uncovered them. One resigned, and the other was dismissed. On February 4 at 11:57 a.m., a certificate of appointment as Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of the Triborough Bridge Authority, signed by the mayor, was brought into the city clerk's office by one of the mayor's secretaries and filed there. The name on the certificate was Robert Moses. With the appointment to the second vacancy of George V. V. McLaughlin, the bluff, red-faced Brooklyn banker and friend of Al Smith's, who had long been Moses's friend and ally, control of the authority was his. Wait, I just have to reread that sentence. With the appointment to the second vacancy of George V. V. It'll probably become clear later. I don't really know what that meant. As soon as it was, a new bill was introduced providing for the creation of the Marine Parkway Authority. Its powers were in general the same as those of the Triborough Bridge Authority, but there was one innovation. These powers would not be exercised by a 3-man board. The authority would have only a sole member, and that member, the man in whom all the powers of the authority were lodged, would be the Park Commissioner of New York City. On April 9, with scarcely any debate, the bill was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. There were now 7 separate governmental agencies concerned with parks and major roads in the New York metropolitan area. They were the Long Island State Park Commission, the New York State Council of Parks, the Jones Beach State Park Authority, the Bethpage State Park Authority, the New York State Park Department, the Triborough Bridge Authority, and the Marine Parkway Authority. Robert Moses was in charge of all of them. Dun dun dun. Where is my coffee? Oh, here you go. Look at, I tried to make a fun coffee drink, but the oat milk all sank to the bottom. So it actually, it's not mixed at all. Oh well. The New Deal's attempts to combat the Depression had apparently already given New York an opportunity to refurbish existing city parks. Henry Hopkins' Federal Civil Works Administration, set up in November 1933, had 68,000 men working on park cleanup projects in the city by Christmas. 68,000 men working on park cleanup projects? I know the New Deal did so many things, but that is so many people. But Moses and his top Long Island Park administrators, driving around to the parks to see what those men were doing, found that the city had given them neither adequate tools, materials, supervision, nor instructions. Crews were laying asphalt roads and paths without adequate foundations, and even as they laid one section, another, completed a week earlier, was already heaving and cracking behind them from frost action. 6,000 men, assigned to move ash dumps in Riverside Park, were standing on the banks of the Hudson, pecking at frozen cinders. Jury's out on what that means. 2,000 were standing on truck beds on a little reef off Staten Island, building up the reef by dumping out sand, which was washed away at a cost of $5 per cubic yard, almost as fast as they could dump it. 5,400 more were assigned to Brooklyn's Marine Park, purchased during the Mitchell administration and allowed to remain undeveloped for 20 years. Moses's engineers sneaked into the cupola of an old mansion in the park so that they could watch the work unobserved, and found that there was nothing to watch. spread out over expanses of sand wastes and marshlands in a scene more reminiscent of a French bivouac during the retreat from Moscow than a park reclamation project. All but a handful of the 5,400 sat huddled around small fires built against the freezing wind whipping out of Jamaica Bay. Some were passing around wine bottles held in brown paper bags. Others were throwing dice. Most had no tools, and Moses' men understood why when they saw men chopping up shovels and using their handles as firewood. Adding a poignant detail to the scene were a few men who had kept their tools and who obviously wanted to work. They spent hours raking the frozen ground or building little fences out of stone they found in the area, just so, as one of them was later to recall, I could feel I was doing something to earn the money. I need to learn more about the New Deal. This is so interesting. Wait, brown paper bags? You're British. Maybe that's, yeah, in the US, because of open carry laws, they give you brown paper bags when you buy pretty much any alcohol. Sometimes even, like, they do it without you asking, just for when you, like, have to walk home, and there have been times where I've been like, "Oh, I don't need a bag, you don't need to waste the bag," and they're like, "What?" Like, sometimes that throws people off. I don't know. I don't know what are the open carry laws like in the UK? Can you just walk around drinking beer? That was one of the best things about Berlin in the summer. Beers were like €1 and you can drink them on the train, anywhere. It was so nice. Open container laws, not open carry. That's a really big difference. Thank you for correcting me. That was that was very different. Although I doubt that I'm the first person to ever make that mistake. You can tell what I meant. Moses himself spent a lot of time at Orchard Beach, a very low, very narrow sandbar that linked together the eastern edges of Hunter's Island and Rodman Neck, two of the little wooded pieces of land at the eastern fringe of Pelham Bay Park that were washed by the water of Long Island Sound. Here, in New York's northeastern corner, so far from any built-up areas in 1934 that visitors could hardly believe they were still within the borders of America's largest city, was located New York's most ambitious park project. When Moses arrived, $346,750 had been spent on bathhouses, a breakwater and a retaining wall running behind the sandbar and designed to turn the bar into a bathing beach convenient to the bungalows of the 600 families, Bronx Democratic stalwarts all, to whom most of the Hunter's Island and Rodman Neck had been leased. The engineer who designed the bathhouses, which were constructed of granite paving stones and had cost $84,000 apiece, had apparently been inspired by the Black Hole of Calcutta. The only ventilation in the 30-foot high buildings was provided by a few narrow slits near the ceilings. The breakwater had been run out into the Sound through the very center of the beach, thereby splitting it into two and forcing anyone wanting to get from one half to the other to climb over the top, which wasn't easy since the breakwater designer had neglected to include steps. But the location of the retaining wall made reservations about the splitting of the beach irrelevant. The engineer who designed the wall had apparently seen the sandbar only at low tide. He had placed the wall so close to the water that for most of the day, the waves lapped right up against it, and there was no longer any beach left to split. Yeah, open container versus open carry would be very interesting. I didn't know that open container varied by state. I didn't even know that. Moses dispatched teams of engineers to inventory New York City's parks. Their acreage, incredibly, no one knew the exact size. Wow. The buildings, paths, roadways, statues, and equipment in them. The condition of those items, and the type and amount of labor and materials that would be required to renovate them. He filed this information in a loose-leaf notebook kept atop his desk. By the time he was sworn in as park commissioner, the notebook was more than a foot thick, and he had a list of 1,800 urgent renovation projects on which 80,000 men could immediately be put to work. But renovation was only a small part of Moses's great plan. Day after day, during the bitterly cold November and early December of 1933, while the great city lay inert in the grip of its long malaise, Robert Moses was being chauffeured around it in the big Packard, Hazel Tappan behind him, with a stenographer's notepad open on her lap. 20 years before, 20 years! As a young staffer in the Bureau of Municipal Research, Robert Moses had wandered around New York City, burning up with ideas, just burning up with them. Now Moses was not young. One of the days he spent in the big Packard was his 45th birthday, but he was still burning. Sometimes it seemed to me that his voice never stopped, Miss Tappan recalls. Things just kept pouring out of him. I remember once we were downturned someplace, and he wanted to see some underground garage for sanitation trucks or something under a city building, there to see if it would interfere with some plans he had for putting a park on the street near it. And we started to go down this spiral ramp, and it was getting darker and darker, and he was still dictating. And finally, it was almost pitch black, and he was still dictating. To this day, I can see it getting darker and darker, and that voice going on, until I finally had to say, Mr. M, wait a minute, I can't see. By late December, the outline of his ideas for large-scale park construction projects was ready. And now, crowded into the Packard with him and Miss Tappan were his Long Island engineers. They came in relays. One crew would drive with him to certain parks, describing these trips. One engineer echoed Francis Perkins's words of 2 decades before. Everything he saw made him think of some way it could be better. And then that crew would go back to Babylon and translate his ideas into general engineering plans, while another would head out with him to other parks. Relays were needed to keep up with him. His orders just poured out, recalls the engineer. Bam, 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 so fast that we used to all try to take them down at once so that when we got out to Babylon, we could put them together and maybe get one complete list of everything he wanted. You would start at dawn. Hell, sometimes we'd start before dawn. I remember driving around Manhattan when everybody was still sleeping, except the milkmen, maybe, and the cops on the beats. I remember once a cop really jumping when that big black car filled with men came around a corner in front of him. And by late afternoon, I can tell you, your head would be just absolutely spinning. But he'd still be firing things at you. Didn't they break for lunch? You didn't break for lunch when you were out driving with Robert Moses. Soon, the engineer's concepts of his ideas were being presented for his approval. With a few exceptions, City Hall is perhaps the most notable. The public works of New York City were hack work designed by hacks. But the men driving around with Robert Moses were not hacks. They included the unknown young architects, landscape architects, and engineers, the Herbert Magoons and Earl Andrewses, responsible for Jones Beach and the other highly acclaimed Long Island parks. And they included Major Gilmore D. Clark and Amar Embury II Clark, designer of the Bronx River Parkway, and other outstanding examples of highway beautification. He was in 1934 the most famous landscape architect in the U.S. He had been in the process of retiring from public work to accept lucrative private assignments. Embury, an architect, had designed Princeton University's classic Class of 1915 dormitory and many of Long Island's most beautiful estates, parks in themselves. In 1934, he had waiting for him more private business commissions than he could handle in a decade. Moses persuaded Clark and Embury to come work on New York parks. Wow, 7 states have no open container regulations? I just assumed they were everywhere. As had been the case with the famous architects who had gathered around him on the barren sandbar called Jones Beach a decade earlier, however, some of the men with him in the Big Packard in 1934 had difficulty grasping the extent of his vision. When the plans came in for Riverside Park, where, 20 years before, he had dreamed of a great highway alongside the water, a highway that would cover the ugly tracks and cleanse the west side of Manhattan of the smoke and stench from the trains that ran along it, they left the tracks uncovered. The engineers told him that to cover them would add millions to the cost of the park development, for which, at the moment, there was almost no money at all in sight. Not to mention the additional millions that would be needed to build the Henry Hudson Bridge across the Harlem River Ship Canal and a parkway linking the bridge with the Sawmill River Parkway. Moses told them to worry only about the plans. He would worry about getting the money for them. Exasperated with their plans for Orchard Beach, he loaded the architects into the Big Packard and drove out onto barren, snow-covered Hunter's Island. Standing under winter-stripped trees on a little hill that rose out of the marshes that fringed the islet, he looked across at Rodman Neck, 400 yards away, at the sandbar, covered now with the thin scum of ice that held them tenuously together, at the Tammany-built breakwater and the whole of Calcutta bathhouses, and at the 600 private bungalows. The sandbar would never be a decent bathing beach as long as those monstrosities were there, he said. He wanted them torn down. He didn't care how much they had cost. Tear them down. And tear down these goddamn bungalows. Yes, all 600 of them. He had been spending a lot of time wandering around up here in the afternoons, he said, and he had decided that the beach should consist of more than just the sandbar. Okay, so this is Orchard Beach, which is north of the city, if that is helpful. Long Island, south, it's southeast, sort of. If it extended all the way around the eastern shore of both Hunter's Island and Rodman Neck, it would be almost a mile long and almost crescent-shaped. In fact, if it extended over to the Twin Islands, he pointed to 2 islets to the northeast, separated from Hunter's Island by 2 narrow strips of water. The length could be a full mile and the shape of the crescent perfect. He wanted the beach extended to the Twin Islands, he said. The strips of water couldn't be very deep. Fill them in. And he wanted the sand on the beach to be gleaming white ocean sand like the kind at Jones Beach and the Rockaway beaches, not their present coarse, pebble-filled gray Long Island Sound sand. The sand could be dredged off the Rockaway beaches and then brought here by barge, up the East River to the Sound. Behind the beach, paralleling its mile-long crescent, he wanted a bathhouse, designed with the same imagination, the same attention to detail as the bathhouses at Jones Beach. He said he didn't want it looking like the typical bathhouse. But that didn't mean it should look like the Jones Beach bathhouses, he said. If his men looked around him, they would see that the setting here was very different from that of Jones Beach. The setting there was the long, low sweep of sand and sea. Here, it was hills and trees. The Jones Beach bathhouse had been long and low, its lines horizontal. The lines here should be more vertical. Perhaps they should start thinking about columns, maybe even, I don't even know what this is, a colonnade. Colonnade. He would leave it to them, but he didn't want any of them forgetting that the function of a bathhouse wasn't to impress or overawe. It was to help people have a good time. He wanted it light, airy, and gay. And for God's sake, he said, use this kind of imagination on the city's other parks. All the city's parks. that's the end of the chapter. We got a little map too. I'll show it to you. I don't even know. So look, he wants to like add land. So okay, sorry. Before, just water. After, connected. Yeah, I did like that chapter. I loved all the LaGuardia stuff. I liked learning about the New York City mayors. That was interesting. Also, last night, for some reason, it came up. I was talking with one of my friends, and I did mention in conversation, I was like, oh, did you know that the mayor of New York City, or one of the mayors of New York City who served in the 1910s, died by falling out of an airplane? And it got, I don't know. People were interested. People seemed to like my comment. Okay, I'm not going to start chapter 20, but it's called 1 year. So that's something I look forward to. I don't know if I'll do this tomorrow, but either tomorrow or the next day. See you later. Have a good weekend.